Okay, so next up on our list of review of concision, clarity, and fluency is clarity, which I think arguably is maybe the most important of all of these. But also, I feel like whenever you start to make things more concise or more fluent, you are also adding clarity to the sentence. However, within our definition for this exercise, clarity is in its own category. So I will go ahead and share my screen now so that you can follow along with me. Let me find it. Here we go. Okay, so slideshow beginning. All right, so clarity helps you to write sentences that readers can understand. I'm sure we've all been in situations where you start reading and then things become very muddled because it's hard to determine who the actor is in the sentence or whose responsibility something is. And so there's all different sorts of situations we come in contact with where clarity is a problem. And so what we'll discuss here are ways that you can help add clarity to your writing to make sure that your audience understands the exact point that you're trying to make. So the first one that we'll talk about, which is a big one in tech writing, is active voice. So I want to be very clear what active voice is and what passive voice is. All right, so active voice means that the actor in the sentence is doing the action, where in passive voice, the action is being done by an actor, right? So there's a difference there. You've got your actor in the actor spot, in the subject spot, and that actor is completing an activity. So for instance, a basic sentence structure would have something like Arthur ate, right? Arthur, in this case, is my dog, but Arthur ate, it's a subject, which is a noun, and it's a verb, and that's an entire sentence. However, if you were going to do something like passive voice, you would say the food was being eaten by Arthur, right? So by the time you start saying was being eaten by, as opposed to ate, then that means that the action is being done by the actor versus the actor doing the action, which I know is kind of a convoluted way to explain it, but it's kind of the way that I make sense of it in my own head. So I thought it might be useful to some of you as well. So you have with an active voice, you have the actor performing an action on the recipient, whereas in passive voice, you're putting the action or the verb into the subject slot of a sentence, which usually you start out the sentence, like in the sentence Arthur ate, Arthur is the actor, and then the action is ate. So usually you start with actor and then action, whereas in passive voice, you start with action followed by actor. You frequently have things like to be verbs, which are and then verbs plus past tense, was supported, are cooked, right? I want to be very clear that passive voice is not the same thing as past tense. So past tense is anything that happened in the past. Passive voice is discussing something passively, right? So in a sentence like Arthur ate, ate is a past tense verb, but ate in and of itself is not passive voice. The reason why things become passive is because you don't say the table legs supported the table, and instead you're saying something like the table was supported by. So instead of saying the table legs supported the table, you're saying it was supported by. So you're adding in that to be verb plus past tense, and that's a pretty good indicator that you have something that's passive voice. So here's some examples. So an active sentence would be Mike takes this class. A passive example would be this class was taken by Mike. You could also, going back and discussing past tense, if you say something like Mike took this class, that's still active, right? It becomes problematic whenever you say this class was taken by Mike, because Mike is the actual actor in the sentence, and you take him out of that subject slot and moved him into the end. So it takes away the focus of the person who's actually doing the action. Another active example, employees make too many personal copies. So that's an active sentence. Whereas passive would be too many personal copies are made by employees. And then the last one, active, would be police identified the robber. Passive would be the robber was identified. And that could be the robber was identified by police. It doesn't really make any difference because you say was identified versus including the actor there, then that makes it passive. So passive voice is almost always better, and we'll talk about some situations where it's not better in a moment. But here's some reasons why it's usually better. One, the reader has to do less work to understand what you mean. They're able, in active voice, they're able to identify the actor, they're able to identify the action, and they're able to make a connection between those two to understand what actually happened or what is happening. The second piece is it is direct. In passive voice, it always sounds a little bit hesitant because you're not being direct. And by being direct, you're making it very clear to your reader exactly what it is that you mean, because again, they're not having to do so much extra work. And then lastly, contrary to popular belief, it does not sound more objective and important. It doesn't sound like you're smarter, right? Some people think that passive voice makes maybe you sound more intelligent, and that's just not true. It just usually makes things less clear and harder for people to understand. So there are situations, as I mentioned, when passive voice is acceptable. One of which is the traditional format requires it. So in science writing, for instance, they don't want to give an actual action to an actor because it's not always necessary, and it's also not the point, right? Because if you have a group of researchers that are working together and one particular researcher ran a specific test, it doesn't matter who that researcher was. All that matters is that the test was run, right? You don't need to say Annie ran the test. Instead, the test was run and this and this and this happened. Because they're not attributing the action to the actor because the actor is not relevant. What's relevant is the science. So that's one of the reasons why it's not included in science writing. It's also a traditional format. They could pretty easily make it use active voice versus passive voice, but they just don't at this point. The second thing is the audience has no reason to know who the actor or agent is. For instance, something like Fred was brought into the emergency room. Somebody brought him there. There may be some situations that you need to know who brought the person, right? But the point here is that he is now in the emergency room and he was brought there by someone. And so in that situation, passive voice is fine. Another reason would be to be indirect or inoffensive or not place blame on someone. For instance, if you were talking to your supervisor and your supervisor was supposed to submit a form to someone, or really if anybody you work with was supposed to submit a form and they haven't yet submitted that form, if you say something like, this particular person you put a name like Danny did not submit the form, then you're blaming him for something. And that could potentially be offensive. Whereas if you say something like the form was not submitted or has not been submitted, and you're not putting an actor there, then you're making it clear that the form wasn't submitted, but you're not actually blaming someone. This is also useful because you may not know whose responsibility something actually was, and so you don't want to place blame on somebody falsely. Another one is something like my time off request was not approved. Generally, somebody approving a time off request would be a supervisor. So if you start emailing out that your boss didn't approve your time off, then I don't know, people may take offense to it. Also, sometimes it's just better to hedge and not specifically say who the actor is because you don't want to be that direct or you don't want to offend someone. There's, of course, like these are two examples. There are situations where surely you would want to use somebody's names there, you want to put an actor, but there are times that it is better just not to include that information. And then lastly, to hide the person behind the action. So for instance, something like the victim was not named. Like in newspapers or something like that, you don't want to always state somebody's name if that person needs to be protected for some reason. Like newspapers do this quite a lot, even in this situation, something like the victim was not named, or if their source is hidden, right? Because they may say, you know, the source said, or you may just want to not attribute it, so you're not necessarily providing information to say who that person is that's doing the action. So let's practice a bit. All right, so example number 1, strength was shown by the women. And so this is a passive sentence because you're saying was shown by, right? Where you could change that to be the women showed strength. So it's more direct. You know who the actor is, you know that the women and that the women showed strength. You're bringing your subject and you're bringing your verb closer together, and all of that helps your reader and helps to make your sentence much stronger, actually. The wall was painted. Here we made up an actor, which in this case is my husband. Chad painted the wall. The Mona Lisa was painted by Leonardo da Vinci. An active sentence for that would be Leonardo da Vinci painted the Mona Lisa. And again, you're moving the actor and the action right next to each other, so it's very clear who's responsible for what. At dinner, 6 shrimp were eaten by Harry. And instead, Harry ate 6 shrimp at dinner. And then lastly, if there are any questions, I can be reached at the number below. Whereas you could say, if you have any questions, call me at the number below, which is a very direct answer, right? Instead of saying you can be reached, then you're saying call, which is a stronger verb. And so all of this helps to make things more clear. So really, just as a review, active voice or passive voice uses lots of weak verbs. It strings words together that are longer and more convoluted and more challenging to understand, whereas active sentences use very strong verbs and they bring your subject and your verb closer together. Another thing to keep in mind is to avoid ambiguous pronoun references. So a pronoun is a word that takes place of a noun in a sentence, so which we're all a lot more familiar with pronouns than we used to be, which is great. But terms like he, she, it, they are all pronouns. And so pronouns can help you not have to repeat the same noun every time you want to make a point. So without pronouns, you could say something like, the leaves fell from the tree, the leaves were brown. But with programs, you could say the leaves fell from the tree, they were brown. And so you're able to not have to repeat yourself quite so much and use, kind of wear out your noun in the sentence, and instead pronouns can take that place and make things less repetitive. If you don't pay attention, pronouns can become confusing because they refer back to more than one object or phrase or an antecedent. It's a big word, doesn't really matter that much for you in this context. However, if you start talking about 3 different people and they're all male, and then you say he right after that, it's going to be very confusing to your reader what specifically it is that who you're referring to. And so you need to be very clear that if you're putting a noun and then you're following it by a pronoun, that there is direct understanding of who that person is or what it is that you're referring to by using the pronoun. So we can try some of these as well. So an ambiguous or vague pronoun reference would be something like, when Samuel dropped the goblet onto the glass table, it broke. The reason why this is confusing is because you don't know what broke, if it was the table or the goblet. And so then you can make your sentence stronger by saying the goblet broke when Samuel dropped it onto the table. Here's another one. Amy had an internship at Dell last summer. This will become her career. What does this refer to? Because Dell could become her career, right? It's very clear, or very unclear exactly what this refers to. Whereas if you say, Amy had an internship at Dell last summer, semicolon, this work will become her career, it makes it clear what specifically this refers to. Because an internship in and of itself is not a career, and Dell in and of itself is not a career, right? And so here you're separating it out and you're saying this work, so you're making it clear what it is specifically that she plans to do. They should increase funding to academic programs. Who is they, right? We say this sort of thing a lot, like they should solve this problem, right? But you don't say who specifically should solve it. So a way to fix that could be something like the state should increase funding to academic programs. So you're making they turn into an actor. And then if you write the next sentence, you could include they, and it would be very clear probably what you were talking about, depending on how you phrase it. Oh, and then the last one, sleeping 8 hours a night is vital to the health of students, yet research clearly shows they simply don't do it. And then you're looking for there, what is the antecedent of it, right? Is it sleeping 8 hours a night? That's being healthy? What specifically is it referring to? And so you can change that to be, although sleeping 8 hours a night is vital to the health of students, research shows they simply don't sleep that much. And so you've made it very clear what it actually refers to in that sentence. All right. So that was a review of clarity. There are lots more things that could help you be clear. Those are not all the ones that exist, but those are a few that are pretty important that we generally cover in 2700. So for those of you who took 2700, that's a review. For those of you maybe who took that class someplace else, might be a review, it might be new information. But you can always reach out to me to help improve the clarity, concision, and fluency in your writing. The TechCom Writing Lab is open. The UNT Writing Lab is open as well. So there are lots of people here to help you and support your writing as you go through the rest of this course. But I appreciate your time. Again, please reach out to me if you've got any questions, if you need any additional information, and I'm happy to help. Thank you. Bye.